Nobody stopped them. That is the part that will stay with you. Two security guards already have their hands on Alyne Okafor, dragging the 26-year-old Nigerian waitress through the front doors of the Grand Seoul Hotel. Her black uniform is stained red with wine. Her crooked little Alyne name tag still hangs from her chest. Rain crashes against the marble steps outside while rich guests stand inside the glowing lobby and watch the humiliation unfold like entertainment. Seo Yi-rin sits comfortably with a champagne glass in her hand and satisfaction in her eyes. Park Min-suk, the hotel owner, watches without lifting a finger. Nobody stops it. And 10 feet away stands Kang Min-jae, the Korean mafia boss whose name can silence entire hotel chains. Black coat. $4,000 suit. 2 bodyguards behind him. A Maybach waiting outside in the rain. He watches the entire thing. And says nothing. Alyne does not cry. She does not beg. She simply stands in the rain afterward, soaked to the skin, carrying that terrible stillness of someone humiliated too publicly to even process it yet. Then the hotel doors open again. Min-jae sets down his champagne glass. Buttons his jacket. Walks past every person who stood there and watched. And steps into the rain after her. Not with pity. Not with charity. He looks at her like a man who made a decision months ago and finally has a reason to act on it. He extends his hand. The entire lobby goes silent behind the glass. Because the woman standing in the rain is not a helpless waitress. She is the woman Kang Min-jae is about to choose. And everyone inside is about to understand exactly what that means. Stay with me, besties. This one is going to be worth every second. 8 months before the rain, Alyne Okafor learned the Grand Seoul Hotel the way she learned everything that mattered. Completely, quietly, and without waiting for anyone to show her how. She had come through the employee entrance on a Tuesday morning in February with a work visa, 2 years of hospitality experience from Lagos, and the particular kind of determination that does not announce itself because it does not need to. She already knew what places like this did with women like her. She had worked enough rooms in enough cities to understand the system without needing it explained. You were invisible when it was convenient and embarrassing when it was not. You absorbed what was given to you and you performed gratitude for the privilege of absorbing it. Alyne had decided, somewhere over the Pacific, that she would do neither. She memorized every table number in the first week. Every regular guest's preference by the end of the second. By the third week she knew which sommelier arrived late on Fridays and quietly covered the gap before anyone noticed it needed covering. Her supervisor Mr. Choi stopped checking her section after the first month. In the Grand Seoul Hotel, that was the closest thing to a standing ovation. The other waitresses were not unkind. They were simply careful around her the way people are careful around someone whose competence quietly raises the standard for everyone nearby. They gave her the difficult tables because they trusted her to handle them. She accepted without comment. Her goal was simple and she repeated it to herself every morning on the bus to work. Stay quiet. Do excellent work. Survive. Then Kang Min-jae began appearing at table 7. Always at exactly 8:17 in the evening. Always the same corner seat with his back to the wall and a clear line to the entrance. Always black tea with no sugar and no unnecessary conversation. The first 2 visits he barely looked at her, the way genuinely powerful men rarely look at the people serving them because they do not need to assess what poses no threat. The third visit changed everything. A woman at the adjacent table, designer dress, the particular confidence of someone who had never once been told no, snapped at Alyne loudly over a minor mistake. Wrong temperature on the water. The kind of complaint designed not to correct anything but to perform superiority for the people nearby watching. Alyne apologized clearly, fixed the issue in under a minute, and walked away without lowering her head. Not quickly. Not with the hunched hurrying of someone trying to escape embarrassment. She simply walked away with the same unhurried steadiness she brought to every movement in that room, as though the woman's cruelty had passed through her like weather and left nothing behind. At table 7, Kang Min-jae set down his cup. He looked at Alyne across the restaurant, not at her face first, not at the uniform or the name tag or the tray balanced in her hand. He looked at her hands. The way they were completely steady. The way her spine did not curve under the weight of being publicly belittled in a room full of people who had watched without moving. He kept looking long after she had moved to the next table. By the 4th month he knew her full name. By the 6th he knew she wired money to her mother in Lagos on the 15th of every month without fail. He knew because he had asked someone to find out, and the fact that he had asked someone to find out was itself information he had spent 2 weeks not examining too closely. By the 8th month Kong Min-jae understood, with the cold clarity he brought to all important assessments, that he had become genuinely attached to a woman who had spoken to him fewer than 40 times and had no idea she was being watched. He also understood that he was not going to do anything about it. He was a careful man. A patient man. A man who had survived 34 years in a world that rewarded discipline and punished sentiment by maintaining an absolute separation between the things he felt and the things he acted on. He would continue to come to table 7. He would continue to order black tea with no sugar. And he would continue to watch Alyne Okafor move through that room with the quiet dignity of a woman who had decided a long time ago that nobody else's assessment of her worth was worth adjusting herself to accommodate. He would watch and he would say nothing and he would make no move. Right up until the night someone gave him a reason. The Grand Seo Hotel knew how to perform generosity. The charity gala transformed the ballroom into something out of a magazine: gold light, cascading flowers, champagne and crystal flutes, Seoul's elite arranged across the space like a curated exhibition of everything money could purchase when it had run out of practical things to buy. The cause being supported was printed on cream cardstock at every table. Most guests had not read it. Alyne moved through the ballroom with practiced precision, her tray level, her expression neutral, her eyes tracking the room the way she tracked every room she worked, efficiently, constantly, 3 steps ahead of the next need before it became a request. She had been on shift since 4 in the afternoon. It was now past 9. Her feet were telling her things she was not in a position to listen to. At the center table sat Seo Yi-rin. Alyne had served her 3 times before at Grand Seo events and understood her the way she understood all difficult guests, completely and without illusion. Yi-rin was the kind of beautiful that required maintenance and the kind of cruel that required an audience. Tonight she had both. She sat surrounded by Seoul's most photographed faces in a cobalt gown that had been chosen to be remembered and held her champagne glass with the ease of a woman who had never once worried about the bill. Her eyes had been following Alyne since the 2nd hour of the event. Alyne noticed. She always noticed. She adjusted her route twice to create more distance, and both times Yi-rin had shifted her position at the table like something was pulling her attention in a direction she could not leave alone. The 3rd time Alyne passed the center table, she was carrying a full tray and moving with the particular focused care of someone balancing something that required her complete attention. Yi-rin tilted her wrist. It was a small movement. Almost nothing. The kind of gesture that could be called accidental by anyone who had not been watching carefully enough to see the deliberateness underneath it. Red wine moved across the tablecloth and directly onto Alyne's uniform in a clean diagonal line that covered her from collarbone to waist. The ballroom gasped. In the half-second before anything else happened, Alyne stood completely still with her tray still level, not because she was calm, but because she had trained herself to absorb impact without visible reaction, and the training held even now, even here, even while 200 people turned to look at her simultaneously. Then Yi-rin was standing. "Are you blind?" Her voice carried across the nearest tables with the practiced clarity of someone who had learned to project without appearing to raise her voice. "Look what you've done. Do you have any idea what this dress costs?" It was such a smooth, complete lie, delivered with such immediate confidence, that several nearby guests began nodding before they had processed what they were agreeing with. Alyne opened her mouth. Park Min-suk arrived before she could produce a sound. He came from the direction of the entrance with the brisk, purposeful movement of a man who had been alerted to a situation requiring management and had already decided on the resolution before seeing the full facts. He looked at Yi-rin first. Her dress. Her friends. The quiet damage of her expression. Then he looked at Alyne. His eyes moved across her wine-stained uniform, her name tag, her tray, and the particular stillness of a woman waiting to be allowed to speak. 3 seconds of assessment. "Remove her," he said. Quietly. To the security staff who had materialized at his shoulder. Through the front entrance. Not the service corridor. Not the employee exit 3 doors down where this could have been handled with some fragment of dignity intact. The front entrance. Marble steps. Full lobby. The longest possible walk through the largest possible audience. The guards moved. Alyne did not fight them. She understood immediately that fighting would produce footage that reframed the story in Yirin's favor, and she was not going to give anyone that. She transferred her tray to the nearest surface with 2 precise movements and then walked. Head level. Shoulders back. The same posture she had walked in with 8 hours ago through the employee entrance with her work visa and her 2 years of experience and her quiet determination. The lobby opened around her. Guests lined the edges of her vision like a corridor of watching faces, phones appearing in hands with the particular reflexive urgency of people who had been trained by years of social media to document rather than intervene. The front doors opened. The rain hit her instantly, cold, heavy, and completely indifferent to what she had just walked through to get there. She stood on the marble steps while the water soaked through her uniform and ran down her face and flattened her curls against her cheeks, and she kept her posture because it was the only thing in that moment that belonged entirely to her and she was not going to let it go. Behind the glass doors the lobby continued watching. Inside the ballroom, at table 7 in the far corner, Kong Min-jae set down his champagne glass with a slowness that had nothing peaceful in it. And stood up. Nobody stopped him. That was the thing people would remember afterward, not what he said, not what he did, but the fact that Kong Min-jae walked through the Grand Seoul Hotel's crowded ballroom toward the front entrance and not one single person in that room found the words or the will to ask him where he was going. He had remained seated for exactly as long as it took him to contain what was moving through him. 30 seconds, maybe 40. Long enough to ensure that what he did next would be deliberate rather than reactive. He was not a man who moved from anger. He was a man who moved from decision. He stood. The change in the ballroom was immediate and involuntary, the way a room changes when something that has been holding still suddenly moves. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Staff who had been crossing the floor found reasons to pause. Park Min-suk, who had been accepting congratulations near the champagne station with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had managed a situation cleanly, looked up and felt the congratulations stop mattering. Min-jae did not look at Min-suk. He did not look at Yirin, who had resettled at the center table with the careful composure of a woman replacing the evidence of what she had just done with the performance of someone who had simply reacted to an unfortunate accident. He buttoned his jacket with one hand, set his champagne on the nearest surface without looking for it, and walked toward the entrance with the unhurried certainty of a man who had already completed every relevant thought. His head of security fell into step 2 paces behind. Not beside, behind. The distance that communicated everything without producing a single word. The lobby parted for him. The front doors opened. Outside, the rain had not softened. Alyne stood on the marble steps with her uniform soaked through and her curls pressed flat against her face and her hands hanging at her sides with a stillness that was not peace but was something she had built to look like it from the outside. She was not crying. She had made the decision not to cry somewhere between the ballroom and the lobby, and the decision had held, and she was going to keep holding it until she was somewhere private enough for it not to matter anymore. She heard the doors open behind her. She did not turn around. She had already decided she was not turning around for anyone from that building. She was going to stand here until her shift manager brought her bag out, and then she was going to walk to the bus stop on the corner, and she was going to go home, and she was going to figure out the rest of it the way she had always figured out the rest of everything, alone, quietly, and without asking anyone for help she was not sure would be offered. Footsteps on the marble steps. They stopped beside her. She turned. Kong Min-jae stood in the rain in a suit that the water was beginning to darken at the shoulders, looking at her with the full, unhurried attention of a man who had stopped being in a hurry the moment he made his decision. He was not looking at the uniform or the wine stain or the ruined name tag still clinging to her chest. He was looking at her face with the particular focus of someone who wants to make absolutely certain the person in front of them is seeing them clearly before they speak. She was seeing him clearly. For the first time in 8 months of black tea and corner tables and careful professional distance, his eyes were not the controlled, accessible eyes of a powerful man managing his surroundings. They were something else. Something that had no professional word for it and that she did not have time to name before he spoke. He extended his hand. Palm upward. Steady in the rain. The gesture of a man making an offer he had already decided was unconditional before she had any opportunity to respond to it. You are coming with me. 4 words. Quiet enough that only she could hear them above the rain. Certain enough that they did not require a raised voice to carry their full weight. Every sensible thing Alyne Okafor had ever learned about powerful men told her not to move. She had built her entire survival in this city on the principle of not owing anything to anyone who operated from a position of power, because power given was power held and she had no interest in being held by anyone. She had good reasons. Practical reasons. Reasons that had kept her safe and self-sufficient for 26 years. She looked at his hand. Then she looked at his eyes. The certainty in them was not the certainty of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. It was something quieter and considerably more dangerous than that. It was the certainty of a man who had already decided that what happened next was not about what he wanted at all. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers without tightening. Not a grip, not a claim, just a steady, unhurried closing that felt less like being taken somewhere and more like being recognized after a very long time of being looked through. They walked down the marble steps together into the waiting city. Behind the glass doors of the Grand Seoul Hotel, Seo Yi-rin stood with her champagne glass held in both hands watching the man she had spent 4 years positioning herself beside walk into the rain with another woman without looking back once. Not once. She stood there for a long time after they had disappeared into the dark and the rain and the enormous indifferent city. And understood, with the cold precision of a woman who had always been very good at reading rooms, that she had not lost something tonight. She had simply discovered that it had never been hers. The mansion was the quietest place Alyne had ever woken up in. She lay still for a long moment before opening her eyes, listening to the quality of the silence around her. Not the thin silence of an empty apartment or the tense silence of a place waiting for something to go wrong, but the deep, settled silence of a building so large and so well ordered that it absorbed sound the way expensive things absorbed everything, completely and without effort. She opened her eyes. The ceiling was high and pale. The bed was the kind of enormous that made practical sense only in a space this size. Someone had left folded clothes on the chair by the window, her size, plain and unworn, chosen with the quiet efficiency of someone who had anticipated a need and met it without making it a gesture. The window overlooked Seoul in the early morning light. Alyne sat up slowly and looked at the city spread below her and understood, with the particular clarity that arrives after a night of surviving something significant, that nothing about this felt temporary. Not the room. Not the clothes on the chair. Not the way the residents had received her the previous night. Staff appearing at precisely the right moments, doors opening before she reached them, everything calibrated to the specific comfort of someone who was expected to stay. That realization sat with her while she changed and washed her face and stood at the window for a long time watching the city wake up below her. It frightened her more than the rain had. Kang Min-jae came to her 2 hours later. He knocked, which she had not expected. He was dressed simply, a dark shirt, no jacket, no visible security in the hallway behind him, and he looked in the plain morning light like something she had not been prepared to see. Not the mafia boss from the ballroom. Not the commanding figure whose presence had changed the atmosphere of every room she had ever watched him enter. Just a man in his 30s who had not slept much and was carrying something considerable and was not pretending otherwise. He sat across from her at the small table by the window. For a moment neither of them spoke. Below the window the city continued its indifferent morning business. A bird somewhere outside. Traffic 17 floors down. I saw everything, he said finally. From the beginning. Yirin's hand. The wine. Min-suk's decision. He looked at her directly. All of it. Alyne held his gaze. I know, she said. Park Min-suk's investors began pulling out at 6 this morning, he continued, in the same tone a person uses to report the weather. His primary bank has initiated a review of his commercial accounts. 3 of his largest business partners have requested urgent meetings, which he will not find reassuring once he understands who requested them. Alyne was quiet for a moment. You did that. Yes. In one night. It did not require much. He said it without pride, simply as a statement of fact about the particular kind of power he carried. The infrastructure for it was already there. Last night simply provided the reason to use it. She looked at him. The morning light came through the window at an angle that caught the tiredness in his face and made him look, for just a moment, like someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had not yet decided whether to set it down. "Why?" she asked. Not combatively. Simply and directly, the way she asked everything that mattered. He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a man choosing his words not because he was hiding something but because he wanted to get them precisely right. "For 8 months," he said, "I watched people treat you as though you were there to absorb whatever they decided to give you. Difficult tables. Unreasonable guests. Complaints designed to humiliate rather than correct." He paused. "You handled every single one without losing something I have very rarely seen in any room, the ability to be treated badly and emerge from it without becoming smaller." Alyne said nothing. She was watching his face. "Last night someone took that further than I was willing to watch without acting," he said. "And so I acted." The morning held them both in its quiet light. "I do not need to be rescued," Alyne said. She said it plainly, without defensiveness. Just truth that needed to be on the table between them from the beginning. "I know," he said. "Then understand what I am asking." "Why me specifically?" "Not the principle of it. I understand the principle." "Why me?" He looked at her for a long moment with the full attention that she had learned, over 8 months of corner table observations, was the rarest thing he gave to anything. "Because you are the only person I have watched, in a very long time, who does not adjust themselves to the room," he said. "Every person in my world performs something. For power, for safety, for access, for approval." He held her gaze. "You simply are who you are. In every room. Regardless of the cost." He paused. "I have spent 34 years in a world that punishes that. Watching you do it anyway, every shift, every week, for 8 months," he stopped. Looked at his hands briefly. Then back at her. "It affected me in ways I was not prepared for and did not plan." The room was completely still. Alyne looked at this man, dangerous, powerful, unexpectedly honest in a plain morning shirt, and understood something she had not understood the night before when she was standing in the rain making a decision with his hand open in front of her. He had not walked out of that hotel because she looked like someone who needed help. He had walked out because for 8 months she had shown him something he had stopped believing existed. A person who was exactly who they were, without performance, without strategy, without the slow erosion of self that his world demanded of everyone who stayed in it long enough. She was not a rescue. She was a reminder. And he had been watching her long enough to know that the difference mattered enormously. "All right," she said quietly. He looked at her. "I am not saying I trust you," she clarified. "I am saying I am willing to find out whether I should." Something shifted in his face. Small but real. "That," he said, "is more than I expected." "I know," she said. And for the first time since she had placed her hand in his on the marble steps the previous night, she felt something in her chest that was not fear and not gratitude and not the careful wariness she brought to everything unfamiliar. It was the quiet, dangerous feeling of a door that had been closed for a very long time opening just slightly. Just enough to let in the light. She arrived without calling ahead. That was the first thing Alyne noticed, not the cream silk, not the pearls, not the particular way Madame Young-Unja moved through a room like she was doing it a favor by entering. It was the fact that she had not called ahead. Because a woman who does not call ahead is a woman who does not believe she needs permission. Alyne was in the kitchen making tea when she heard the front door. She did not rush out. She finished what she was doing, set both cups on the counter, and waited. She had learned, in 8 months of reading wealthy people across hotel tables, that the ones who arrived unannounced were always trying to catch something off guard. She had no intention of being caught. Unja found her there 2 minutes later. She stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at Alyne the way she probably looked at balance sheets, searching for the weakness in the numbers before committing to a position. "You are comfortable here," she said. Not a compliment. An observation with an edge underneath it. "I am," Alyne said simply. "Would you like tea?" Something shifted in Unja's expression. She had expected nervousness. She sat down at the kitchen table with the composure of a woman rearranging her strategy without showing the rearrangement, and accepted the cup Alyne placed in front of her. "My son is a complicated man," she began. "Most people worth knowing are," Alyne said. Unja paused. Tried a different direction. "He carries responsibilities that most people cannot imagine. His world has a particular shape. The people in it must be able to carry that shape without breaking." "I understand," Alyne said. "Do you?" Unja's voice sharpened slightly, just enough to communicate that the warmth had been a courtesy and not a conviction. "Because a woman who was removed from a hotel in the rain 3 days ago is not someone who strengthens my son's position. She is someone who complicates it." The kitchen was completely quiet. Alyne wrapped both hands around her cup. She took one slow sip, set it down, and looked at Madame Jung Unja with the full, unhurried directness that had been stopping people mid-sentence since she arrived in this city. "With respect," she said quietly, "I was removed from that hotel because a woman lied and a man chose her lie over my dignity. That says something about them." She paused. "It says nothing about my ability to stand beside your son." Unja said nothing. "I have never broken under pressure," Alyne continued. "Not once. Not in that hotel, not in that rain, and not in this kitchen." She met the older woman's eyes without blinking. "That is not a weakness in your son's world. That is exactly what his world requires." The silence that followed was the longest one Alyne had sat inside since arriving at the residence. Unja looked at her tea. Then at Alyne. Then at her tea again. She stood, smoothed the front of her silk jacket, and walked to the kitchen doorway without another word. Then she stopped. "Minjae takes his tea without sugar," she said, without turning around. "He has since he was 17. His father was the same way." She left before Alyne could respond. Alyne sat alone in the kitchen for a long moment, both cups still warm on the counter. She understood what had just happened, not a defeat, not a victory, but something more complicated and considerably more significant than either. Madame Jung Unja had just told her something true about her son. And a woman who shares the truth is a woman who has not yet decided to remain an enemy. The art gallery event was Yirin's idea. Alyne understood this the moment she walked through the entrance and saw the guest list had been arranged so that their paths would cross within the first 10 minutes. It was too precise to be accidental. Every detail, the positioning of the welcome table, the narrow corridor between the first exhibition room and the champagne station, spoke of a woman who had planned the geography of the evening the way a general plans a battlefield. Alyne had worn a simple black dress. Not because she lacked options. Minjae had offered to arrange whatever she needed for the evening, and she had told him, pleasantly but without room for discussion, that she was perfectly capable of dressing herself. He had looked at her for a moment and then nodded with the particular expression of a man who has just been reminded of something he already knew. She looked exactly like herself when she walked in. That was entirely the point. Yirin found her near the second exhibition room, right on schedule. She was wearing cobalt blue and carrying champagne and the specific smile of a woman who has decided the evening belongs to her before it has properly begun. "Alyne," she said warmly, like they were old friends. "I almost didn't recognize you." She tilted her head with practiced grace. "It's brave of you to show your face after that wine incident. I genuinely admire the confidence." Several nearby guests went still. The corridor narrowed around them the way corridors do when something significant is happening and every person present can feel it. Alyne looked at Yirin. She did not look away. Did not adjust her expression. Did not perform discomfort for an audience that was clearly hoping for exactly that. She smiled. It was a real smile, which made it considerably more dangerous than any other kind. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet corridor. It was very brave of you to spill wine on me deliberately in front of 200 witnesses. She paused, just long enough. I have always admired that kind of commitment to a plan. The corridor went completely silent. Someone near the champagne station made a sound that was immediately swallowed. Yirin's smile stayed on her face through sheer force of practice, but something behind her eyes shifted rapidly, the frantic recalculation of a woman who had scripted this scene carefully and just watched the other person refuse to read from the correct page. I don't know what you're implying, she said, her voice slightly less steady than before. I'm not implying anything, Alyne said pleasantly. I'm simply agreeing that bravery comes in many forms. She excused herself and moved toward the next exhibition room with the unhurried ease of a woman who had just finished a conversation that no longer required her presence. Across the gallery, Kang Min-jae stood with a glass of water he had not touched, watching the entire exchange from beginning to end. He felt something settle in his chest that had not been settled since the night of the rain, the particular stillness of a man watching someone he chose prove, without any assistance from him, exactly why he chose them. He set the glass down on the nearest surface. And for the first time since Yirin had positioned herself in his orbit 4 years ago, he turned away from her without a second look. Yirin watched him turn away. And understood, with the cold clarity of a woman who had just run out of moves, that the thing she had spent 4 years building toward had been decided on a rainy pavement outside a hotel she had not even been watching. She set her champagne glass down on the nearest surface and stood very still in the gallery corridor, surrounded by art that suddenly felt very far away, and made herself look at the truth she had been avoiding since that night. She had not lost Kang Min-jae to a waitress in a wine-stained uniform. She had lost him to a woman who never needed to compete, because a woman who is entirely herself in every room she enters is not competing with anyone. She was simply being what Yirin, with all her preparation and positioning and practice smiles, had never once managed to be. Real. It started just after 11. Alyne was in the library with a book she was actually reading this time when she heard the first shout from somewhere beyond the residence gates. Then a second. Then the particular sound of multiple people moving quickly through the hallways, not the measured movement of staff going about their evening, but the urgent, purposeful movement of people responding to something that had gone wrong. Security alarms. Radio voices. The front gate intercom crackling. She heard 2 of Min-jae's bodyguards run past the library door. She put her book down. She did not panic. She assessed. There was a difference, and she had learned it early. Panic responds to the feeling of danger, assessment responds to the actual shape of it. She crossed to the doorway and looked into the hallway and understood within 30 seconds what kind of situation this was. Not a threat inside the residence. A threat outside it pressing inward. She went to the kitchen. The 2 youngest members of Min-jae's household staff were there, a girl named Hannah who managed the residence schedule and a quiet young man named Dae who handled deliveries. Both of them were standing in the middle of the kitchen looking at each other with the wide-eyed stillness of people who did not know what to do with their hands. Sit down, Alyne said calmly. Not unkindly. Just with the straightforward authority of someone who has decided the situation requires a particular kind of management. They sat. She filled the kettle because hot tea was useful and because the act of making something was itself a form of steadiness that frightened people needed to be around. She answered the kitchen phone when it rang, one of the security team checking interior positions, and responded in the clean, functional Korean she had been quietly building for 8 months in a city that had not always made space for her to use it. She checked the residence's internal communication panel. Reported the kitchen clear. Asked for an update on the timeline. Hannah stared at her. You are not scared, the girl said, like it was something she needed to confirm out loud. I am focused, Alyne said. There is a difference. 40 minutes later the situation outside the gates resolved the way these things apparently resolved in Min-jae's world. Quickly, quietly, and without full explanation. The alarms stopped. The radio voices faded. The particular tension in the residence's atmosphere released slowly, like a held breath finally let go. Min-jae came to the kitchen 20 minutes after that. He stood in the doorway and looked at the scene, Hannah and Dae seated at the table with warm cups in front of them, the kitchen in perfect order, Alyne at the counter pouring a third cup with the same unhurried steadiness she brought to everything she did in this residence. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through him that he had no precise word for, not surprise, because he had stopped being surprised by her weeks ago, but something deeper and quieter than surprise. The recognition of a man who had spent his entire adult life surrounded by people who performed composure, watching someone who simply possessed it. "I have never," he said quietly, "met anyone like you." Alyne set the cup on the counter and looked at him with the slight smile that meant she was genuinely amused rather than performing amusement. "I know," she said. He stood in the doorway a moment longer than he needed to. Then, for the first time since she had known him, Kang Min-jae, feared by more people in this city than she could count, carrying more weight in his silence than most men carried in their loudest moments, almost laughed. It was a small sound. Barely there. But Hannah and Dae both looked up from their cups, because neither of them had ever heard it before either. Seoul's charity gala circuit had a memory. Every attendee, every photographer, every carefully positioned socialite understood that these events were not simply fundraisers. They were records. Who arrived with whom? Who stood beside whom at the champagne table? Who left with whom when the evening ended? The social architecture of this city was built and maintained in rooms exactly like this one, and everyone who entered them understood the rules without being told. Seo Yi-rin had dressed accordingly. She arrived 40 minutes early in a floor-length emerald gown and positioned herself near the entrance with the practiced ease of a woman who had been working these rooms since she was 22. She knew exactly where Min-jae would enter. She knew which photographer covered the entrance. She knew that arriving early and standing in the right place at the right moment created a narrative that was considerably harder to rewrite later. She had done this before. It had always worked before. The ballroom doors opened at 8. Kang Min-jae walked in. Alyne Okafor walked in beside him. The sound of the room did not disappear all at once. It faded, unevenly, in the spreading pattern of people noticing something and then the people beside them noticing those people noticing, until the entire ballroom had registered what was happening and the music from the far end felt suddenly louder because everything else had become quieter. Alyne wore black. Simple, clean, entirely her own. No borrowed diamonds. No designer gown selected to signal arrival into a particular world. Just herself, composed and unhurried, her hand resting lightly in the crook of Min-jae's arm with the ease of someone who had stopped needing to justify her presence in any room a long time ago. Min-jae did not scan the room the way he usually scanned rooms, assessing, positioning, identifying variables. He looked at the ballroom once and then looked at the woman beside him when she said something quietly, and the expression that crossed his face in response was so private and so genuine that 3 people standing nearby simultaneously understood they were watching something that had nothing to do with them. He smiled. Not the controlled, surface-level expression he used for business. Not the particular arrangement of his features that communicated authority without warmth. A real smile, small and entirely unperformed, the kind that arrives before a person has decided to show it. Yi-rin watched it happen from across the room. She had spent 4 years studying Kang Min-jae in rooms like this one. She knew the difference between the smile he gave to business associates and the one he gave to people he was managing and the one he occasionally produced for social occasions. She had catalogued all of them and understood all of them. She had never seen this one before. Not once. Not directed at her. Not directed at anyone. She set her champagne glass down on the nearest surface and stood very still in her emerald gown while the room continued its careful realignment around the 2 people who had just walked through the door. The most painful thing was not the gown. Not the positioning. Not the 4 years of careful strategic presence in rooms exactly like this one. It was the realization arriving slowly and then all at once, the way the most honest realizations always arrive, that she had never actually been competing for something that was available. Min-jae had already decided, in a corner booth over black tea with no sugar, 8 months before that rainy pavement, before the wine, before any of this. She had simply not been watching the right thing. Across the ballroom Alyne said something else quietly and Min-jae bent his head slightly to hear it and the photographer near the entrance, who had been waiting 40 minutes for the shot Yi-rin had positioned herself to be part of, raised his camera. and took a completely different picture than anyone had planned for. Yirin left the gala an hour before it ended. She sat in the back of her car in the underground car park and looked at her hands in her lap, the manicured nails, the diamond bracelet, everything precisely maintained and precisely chosen, and felt the particular exhaustion of a woman who has performed so completely and for so long that she can no longer locate the person underneath the performance. She had walked into that hotel ballroom on the night of the rain with a deliberate plan and had executed it without hesitation. She had not thought about Alyne as a person. She had thought about her as an obstacle, something to be removed from a space Yirin had decided belonged to her. She sat in the quiet of the car and understood, for the first time, what that said about who she had allowed herself to become. She picked up her phone. Put it down. Picked it up again. She did not know yet what she was going to do with the truth she was sitting with. But she knew, with the cold clarity that had always been her most honest quality, that something had to change. Because a woman who could only feel powerful by making someone else feel small was not powerful at all. She was simply afraid. She did not hear Unja come in. That was unusual. Madame Young Unja was not a woman who entered rooms quietly. She entered them with the particular deliberateness of someone who understood that arrival was itself a statement, the sound of heels on marble, the slight adjustment of atmosphere that happened when a woman of her authority decided to occupy a space. But tonight she came into the library without any of that. She simply appeared in the doorway in a plain charcoal cardigan with no pearls and no silk and no carefully arranged expression designed to communicate something specific. Just a woman in her late 60s who looked, for the first time since Alyne had known her, exactly her age. Alyne closed her book. Unja sat down across from her without being invited and without the usual performance of deciding where to sit. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at Alyne for a long moment, not the assessing look of the kitchen visit, not the strategic look of a woman positioning herself for a particular outcome. Just looking. The way people look when they have finally stopped trying to see what they came prepared to see and are allowing themselves to see what is actually there. I owe you something, Unja said. Alyne waited. I came to this residence to remove you from my son's life. She said it plainly, without softening it. I was wrong. The library was completely still around them. Minjae stopped eating properly after his father died. Unja continued, her voice quieter now. For almost 2 years, food became something he simply endured. I watched it happen and could not fix it. She looked at her hands. The first dinner I attended here where he ate the way he used to, slowly, with actual attention, like the meal was something worth being present for, was the evening I realized I had been asking the wrong question the entire time. Alyne felt something move in her chest. She kept her expression steady but she felt it. I kept asking what kind of woman fits my son's world, Unja said. I should have been asking what kind of woman makes him want to live in it. The silence that followed was the softest one Alyne had sat inside since arriving in Seoul. She looked at this woman, proud, complicated, genuinely formidable, and felt something she had not expected to feel toward her. Not forgiveness exactly. Something quieter and more honest than that. Recognition. The recognition of one woman who loves someone difficult seeing another woman who loves someone difficult and understanding, without words, exactly what that costs. Then I will tell you something true, Alyne said. So there is no confusion going forward. Unja looked up. I am Nigerian. I am black. I came to this city with a work visa and 2 suitcases and I have spent 8 months being invisible in rooms that were not built for me. Alyne's voice was calm and completely without apology. I was a waitress. I was dragged out of a hotel in the rain while people watched and did nothing. She held Unja's gaze without blinking. And I have not spent a single day of my life being ashamed of any of it. Unja was very still. If Minjae chooses me, Alyne continued, he chooses all of me. Not a quieter version. Not a version that makes his world more comfortable or his mother less complicated or his image more manageable. She paused. All of me. Completely. Without reduction. She let the words settle. That is not a negotiation. That is simply what is true. The library held the silence between them for a long, full moment. Then Madame Jung Unja, who had controlled every room she had entered for 40 years, who had never once nodded at anything she had not first decided to agree with, looked at the young Nigerian woman sitting across from her in her son's library and nodded once. "Good," she said. And for the first time since she had arrived at this residence, she meant it with her whole chest. She stood, smoothed the front of her cardigan, walked to the library door. Then she stopped. "He takes his tea without sugar," she said quietly, without turning around. "But lately he has been taking it with whatever you put in it instead." She left before Alyne could see her almost smile. Alyne found Minjae on the terrace an hour later. He was standing at the railing looking out over Seoul the way he stood at most things, completely still, carrying the full weight of whatever he was thinking without letting any of it show on the surface. The city spread below them in every direction, enormous and glittering and entirely indifferent to the two people standing above it. She came and stood beside him. Not a careful distance away. Beside him. Close enough that their arms were almost touching, close enough that he turned his head slightly when she arrived and then turned back to the city without moving away, which was itself the most honest thing either of them had said to each other all evening. They stood together in the cooling night air and said nothing for a long time. Below them Seoul moved without them, taxis and lights and a million lives being lived simultaneously in every direction. She had arrived in this city alone, survived it alone, been humiliated in the rain and offered a hand she had almost been too sensible to take. She had walked through a mafia boss's residence and a proud mother's opposition and a socialite's public campaign and had not once pretended to be smaller than she was to make any of it easier for anyone. And she was still here. Choosing to be. "Unja came to see me tonight," she said. Minjae was quiet for a moment. "I know." She said, "You have not looked alive in years." He did not respond immediately. The city hummed below them. Somewhere far down on the street a car horn sounded and faded. "She is not wrong," he said finally. Alyne looked at his profile. The sharp features softened slightly by the city light. The particular stillness of a man who had spent so long being feared that being genuinely seen had become something he no longer knew how to prepare for. She understood that. She understood it more than she had expected to. "Minjae," she said quietly. He turned and looked at her. "I am not going to be easy," she said. "I am not going to be quiet when I should speak or small when I take up space or grateful in the way people expect women like me to be grateful." She looked at him steadily. "I am going to be exactly who I am. Every single day." He looked at her for a long moment with the full, unhurried attention that had first stopped her in her tracks on a rainy pavement outside a hotel that had thrown her out. "I know," he said. "And you still want this." He reached out and took her hand with the same calm certainty with which he had extended it in the rain. No performance, no hesitation, just a decision made completely by a man who did not make decisions he intended to revisit. "I wanted this," he said quietly, "before I had a reason to act on it." Alyne looked down at their hands. Then she looked back at the city, enormous and indifferent and completely unbothered by the fact that something had just been decided on a terrace above it that would change both their lives in ways neither of them could fully see yet. She had arrived in Seoul believing that surviving was the best she could build for herself in a world that had not been designed to make room for her. She had spent 8 months invisible in a hotel that threw her out in the rain. She had stood on a wet pavement with nothing, no job, no plan, no idea what came next, and taken the hand of the most dangerous man in the city because something in his eyes told her he was not offering charity. He was offering recognition. And she had spent her whole life waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for someone to look at her and see not a problem to be managed or a uniform to be removed or a shape that did not fit the world's expectations, but the actual woman. Whole and undiminished and entirely worth choosing. She tightened her hand around his. Below them the city carried on. Above it, two people stood in the quiet dark and let what had always been true finally become real. Because the most powerful thing a woman can do in a world that keeps trying to reduce her, is refuse. Quietly, completely, and without apology, to ever become less than she already is. Moral lessons derived from this story. 1. A person's worth is never determined by status, wealth, or background. Alyne was treated as invisible because people judged her job and her appearance instead of her character. The story reminds us that dignity, integrity, and inner strength matter far more than social status. The most powerful person in any room is not the one with the most money, it is the one who knows exactly who they are and refuses to become less. 2. Real love protects, respects, and publicly stands beside you. Min-jae's greatest act was not stepping into the rain, it was choosing Alyne openly, consistently, and without shame in front of every person whose opinion was supposed to matter to him. True love is not hidden when things become difficult. It stands beside you when the world is watching and does not look away. Drop what you learned from this story in the comment section. We are here to educate the world together. And if you enjoyed our work, give us a thumbs up in the comment section and subscribe to the lovable Mafia Boss Story if you believe that true love is not hidden when things become difficult.